This video covers the contents of the SAP Cloud Platform Workflow virtual event, content which is available on GitHub, and specifically it covers the content for exercise 9, which is where we add a user task to our existing workflow definition. So in exercise 9, what we're going to do is to reopen the workflow definition. We're going to add a user task to the definition, and we're going to build the workflow definition, deploy it again, and have a look to see how that works. And then we're going to come back and add a form to the user task. We're going to define a form so that we can interact with data within the context. We're going to add that form to the workflow definition, deploy it again, and then see what that gives us. Okay, so let's get started. I've already got my App Studio session up here. So let's switch back to the order process graphical editor. And as you can see here, I've used the icons to reflow the display of my workflow definition so that it's vertical. So I've got a little bit more space to play with here. Okay, in the same way that we added a service task in the previous exercise, we're now going to add a user task. And we want to add the user task to come after the service task. Now it might look as though there's not enough space here, but we can do that and then get the graphical editor to reflow that for us. So as we can see here, just like last time, we have a warning decorator here, and we can see that actually the user task requires a few settings. So let's deal with those right now. Let's move this. In fact, let's close this terminal so we can see as much of the workflow and user task properties as we can. So let's go and specify the details of the user task properties. So let's keep the priority as medium. In the subject, what we want, for example, is a string that makes sense, and we can use data from the workflow instance's context. So if you remember from the previous exercise, we had data retrieved from the backend service and stored in the product info node. Within there, we have a name property that we want to use in the subject. Similarly, we can put a bit of text in the description. Again, that uses some information from the context. In this case, it uses the quantity property from the original request. Now, in a trial account, it makes sense here to use my own ID, so I can send myself the user task. We don't need to send the user task to a group, and we also don't need to configure the due date. So that's fine. So as far as we're concerned now, we have details specified, but there's one more thing to do before we can actually deploy that to the cloud platform. In the user interface tab, we also need to specify how that given data is to be displayed in the context of the user task that's created. Now, normally this is where we'd specify the component ID of a specific UI5 based HTML5 app, for example. But for now, we're just going to put some dummy values in just to satisfy the editor. And with that, we can actually make sure that everything's saved and deploy it. So let's go back to the Explorer, and we'll deploy it in the same way that we did last time. We'll open up a terminal and we'll move into the order flow directory. And this time we'll build it and deploy it in basically a single step. MBT build, and then we're using the ampersand, the logical and, to say, well, run this next command if the first command completes successfully. CF deploy MTA archives order flow 001.mtar. Now, of course, that file already exists, but it will be updated or recreated by the MBT build. So let's run that now. Great. So that new version of our workflow definition has been deployed. As it instructs us to do here, we want to create another instance of this workflow definition now, and we'll use that using that collection runner in Postman like we did in the previous exercise. So I've got Postman up here. Let's bring that to the fore, and in fact, let's make that full screen for a second. Okay, so we're ready to run this already. So let's send a request, and we have a new ID, E41E, for the order process workflow instance. So we've got a new workflow instance. So let's have a look at that now in the My Inbox app. If we go now to our trial subaccount home, we can use the usual link to get to our application that's fronting the Fiori Launchpad site. And we can see, as well as our Monitor Workflows tiles, we've also got our My Inbox tile, but this time we have an entry. We can see that we've got a basic display of the user task. So this is the request for, and then the product name, which comes directly from the subject here. In the description, please review this request for X items. We've got that there. And we've got some default information as well. And the reason we're seeing it like this is because basically there's not much else. There are no action buttons. And this is because we haven't defined a proper user task display mechanism. So to clean this up now, we can't complete this from within the My Inbox app. So let's switch back now to the Monitor Workflow instances. We can see, in this case, the workflow instance, it's still in the running state. And in fact, if we look at the execution log, we can see the task request for Notebook Basic 19 is available. We can use the terminate button here to complete it, to clean things up. So now what we're going to do is we're going to fix the issue with the fact that we're not properly displaying anything in the My Inbox by adding a form. You can build custom UI5 components, or we can use a zero-code form builder facility within the workflow editor itself. So we'll do that now. First of all, let's close that terminal. And now if we look in the user interface section of the user task definition, we'll switch the type from SAP UI5 component to form, as shown here. And we get the chance to create a form file, a file where the form will be defined and saved. Here we can specify various properties. Request decision, that's the name of the form. It already takes an ID from the name. We can give it revision 1, and we'll leave the type as a task form. So at this point, we're presented with a form definer. And here we can create a series of sections and fields as shown here in this step of the exercise. So we'll do that now. It's very simple. We can add a section. The first section is going to be called product info. And then within that section, we can add some fields. So we'll add the field ID. That's a string. And then we'll use the definition of the context path to say where this information is either coming from or going to. So we'll specify context.productinfo. Remember, that's the capital I, and that's the node within our context that we asked for the entity data that was retrieved in the service task to be saved. Within there, we have .d.id. We can add another field. That is going to be name. That's also a string, and similarly, we're going to get that information from the name property within productinfo.d. And finally, in this section, we'll have a stock field. That's going to be an integer, and the stock quantity property. The next thing we want to do is to add a new section where we can add a field to request comments. That's going to be a string, and slightly differently here, what we want is a place in the context to store whatever comments are entered in this field. So let's store them in the response.comments property. Now, let's make some adjustments to the fields here so that the ID field is an input field, but the mode is display only. Similarly, for the name field, again, for the stock field. And we want our comment field open for input, so we'll leave that editable, but we want a little bit of a bigger space, so we'll use that. We'll define a text area for that. Okay, now we can move on to the Decisions tab and add two decisions, i.e. user task actions. So we can add a decision here, approve, for example, and we'll make that a positive decision. That will influence how the decision button is rendered. And we'll add one more, which is reject, and we'll specify that as type negative. And that's pretty much it. So we need to make sure everything is saved in the App Studio. This is usually the case. And we can follow the same build and deploy flow as before. So let's do that now. Let's open up a new terminal and let's go into the order flow directory. And in fact, using bash shell history, we can get up to our previous command and run the build and deploy two-step process. So that's completed successfully. So now let's do one more workflow instance using Postman. All we need to do is go across to Postman and hit send again. And we have another instance created, F96D. We can minimize that again. Now let's go back to the inbox and have a look at the new user task that should be there now for us waiting. Great. We have a much nicer user task display here. We can see the results of the form definition that we created. We still have the title, request for Notebook Basic 19. We still have the description, please review this request for 26 items. We still have some basic information here, but now we have two sections. These sections are product info and comments, and we can see the three fields we defined as read-only and a comment field here too. Let's enter a comment into the input box and then choose to either approve or reject the item. Let's approve it. So now we've approved, we've taken a decision on the user task disappears. And in fact, that should lead to the completion of that particular workflow instance. Let's just double check. We can see there's the one we terminated. And here's the one that we've just completed now. If you look at the execution log, we can see that I completed the task there. Okay, so we've now got, as well as a service task, we've got a user task in our workflow definition, and we've also defined a form that we're pointing to in that user task definition to present information to the user and also to receive information from the user plus the decision. Thanks for watching.